So, the Supreme Court is slated to rule in the very near future with regard to your right to keep and bear arms and whether you do, in fact, have a concealed carry right. Stephen Halbrook is an attorney who's authored 10 Second Amendment-related books. His new book is The Right to Bear Arms, a Constitutional Right of the People or a Privilege of the Ruling Class. Stephen, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Hey, good to see you, Ben. Thank you for that.
So why don't we start by talking about what exactly is in front of the Supreme Court at this time, and what do you think the Supreme Court's going to do about it?
I'm optimistic. The Supreme Court, we have some new justices there, obviously. Amy Coney Barrett has a record as a lower court judge on the Seventh Circuit for Court of Appeals on the Second Amendment. And so the fact that they took the case suggests that they at least have 5 people willing to vote the right way. What's at stake here, of course, is that the Second Amendment explicitly protects the right of the people to bear arms, and that right shall not be infringed. And so we've got these lower courts holding that, no, you don't have that right at all. This is just something the government will bestow upon you if they are, if you're in the privileged class. And so you get very few people with carry permits in the state of New York and 7 other states nationwide. We've got 42 states with the right to carry, recognize Second Amendment rights, but we've got those states that do not. So we're hoping for a definitive Supreme Court ruling on this issue.
It is fairly incredible how restrictive some of these states are. I used to live in the state of California. I was in LA County, which is one of the worst places in America if you actually want to get a conceal and carry permit. I actually, at one point, walked into the LAPD with a sheaf of death threats. I mean, like, it was like a binder. And I showed them that the FBI had actually arrested someone the previous year for death threats on my family. And they promptly proceeded to explain that because the FBI had arrested that particular person, there was no longer any threat to me, despite the fact that there were other threats that were still ongoing, and therefore I didn't deserve a concealed carry permit. That sort of stuff does happen in the states that you were mentioning before. They call this the proper purpose, right? You have to have a concealed carry
Right.
you have to have a proper purpose in order to conceal and carry. How restrictive are these sorts of rules?
Well, in the state of New York, and that's the state law that's before the Supreme Court, proper purpose really doesn't exist unless you're a celebrity, somebody considered very politically important, or you pay the right bribes. There was a huge scandal in the city of New York 2 years ago where people were buying permits. But their courts rule that just because you live in a high crime area doesn't qualify you. And what's incredible, like in your case in California, for example, even the death threats don't help. But the fact is, most people don't get death threats, but they still have the Second Amendment right to bear arms. And so there should not be discretion about whether you can exercise a constitutional right. Those who choose to do so should be able to do so, just like First Amendment free speech and whatnot. Nobody's required to do it, but you should be able to do it if that's your forte. So a coincidence occurred here. Like, my book came out on a Friday, and it was the following Monday that the Supreme Court said they would hear this issue. And it's the very same issue that we deal with in the book. The book is The Right to Bear Arms, a constitutional right of the people or a privilege of the ruling class. And what these lower courts are holding in those states is that it's just a privilege of the ruling class to the right to bear arms. And what an incredible thing to say about any constitutional right, that government officials decide whether you can exercise that right or not.
So, meanwhile, Stephen, there have been a lot of folks on the left who have started making the historically revisionist argument that the right to keep and bear arms was rooted in white supremacy, because this is the new argument of the day, is that every single thing in American life is rooted in white supremacy. And so the idea is that the long-held tradition of Americans owning arms is really due to fear of black people, and that is why people seek to uphold it today. What's the actual history of the Second Amendment, and what relationship does it have with race?
Well, the actual history is that the immediate history that led to the American Revolution was what the British were disarming the Americans. They wanted to tax them without representation. They wanted to do all those other things that they used to teach in school. I don't know if they do anymore. And the reason given for the Second Amendment was, we don't want this happening to us again. People have a right to self-defense, including from a tyrannical government. And if you look at the states that were demanding the Second Amendment or that had a right to bear arms in their state constitution, it was by and large northern states. I mean, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, these states were demanding a Second Amendment right, and they weren't exactly slaveholding states. This is a recycled argument that's been made. It was made 20 years ago, and it was invalid then as it's invalid now. The problem was that Second Amendment rights were not extended to African Americans, just like First Amendment rights weren't either. I mean, you could say, oh, well, Black people didn't have First Amendment rights back in the days of slavery or during the first part of Reconstruction, and therefore the First Amendment was intended to promote white supremacy. And so it's no more valid for that purpose than it is for the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court's not going to pay attention to this kind of trash, by the way. They're not going to say, oh, well, Second Amendment is tainted. And you could say the same thing, as I mentioned, about the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment. This is just a made up argument to denigrate Second Amendment rights. And African Americans have just as much of a right now to bear arms as any other American, and many of them are doing that. They're exercising their right in record numbers. They're buying guns, and so are Latinos and others, women. So this is a robust right, and people are exercising it.
And Stephen Halbrook, his new book is The Right to Bear Arms, a constitutional right of the people or a privilege of the ruling class. Stephen, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ben. Good to see you.